All right, well, welcome, guys, to Hampton 3 Gallery. This is Coffee and Conversation with Brian Rutenberg. I'm Luke DeLello. I'm the curator here, and we are just really happy to have Brian here this morning with us. This was a very, very fun show to put together. So we're going to start it off with mud.
Okay.
Anybody who knows South Carolina Low Country knows we have great mud. So, Brian, talk a little bit about growing up in the Low Country, playing with mud, and how that affected your later work.
I first want to thank everybody for coming out today, for sharing this with us. And I want to thank Sandy and Gerald and Mary Melberg, who made this happen for me. I'm really humbled to be here. And mud is a favorite topic of mine. I was my greatest blessing in life was being born and raised in South Carolina. And I was born in one place that has two faces, Myrtle Beach. One face is a resort town full of neon blinking candy-colored lights and all-you-can-eat Calabash seafood signs 3 stories tall. The other face is some of the most hauntingly beautiful landscapes on the East Coast. And what I discovered pretty early on was, as a kid, I was very shy. I was gloriously horrible at sports, and I am the reason that paper towels are on school supply lists. But I could pay attention. So I noticed 2 colliding landscapes in front of me, one natural, one artificial. And that collision, I think, has been the chassis of my work for 47 years. Forcing 2 places that don't go together, I think, is what made me a painter. So I was very attuned as a kid to humidity and to the visceral stickiness of pluff mud. And I would go into the marsh and splat the mud on the dock and then arrange bits of colored paper across the mud, then a little more mud on top of that, and then I'd grab an oyster shell right at my feet and scrape it, and notice that the colors were of varying degrees of intensity based on how hard or lightly I scraped. So right there, I wasn't trying to make anything. I just felt good having these tactile experiences, and everything I needed was right there at my feet. And I've always believed that everything one needs to be a painter, you've probably had since the first grade. And it's right in front of you, and I was fortunate to grow up in Myrtle Beach to be able to access that. So Myrtle Beach in the late 70s, early 80s offered virtually no exposure to the fine arts. I knew about putt-putt golf and hush puppies. That's pretty much it. So my art education began at Brook Green Gardens and at Chapin Memorial Public Library, where a couple days a week my mom would drop me off after school, and I would pour through the art history section volume by volume. And I still remember it was the 700s in the Dewey Decimal System. And the great thing that happened during those years, I was probably 13 or 14, was that the library gave me the gift of misunderstanding. And what I mean by that is when you're too young and you don't have the cognitive ability to understand what you're studying, you start to fill in the blanks yourself and you make stuff up. And you take all these little detours because you don't really comprehend what you're reading, but yet I kept looking at images. I was studying, French mannerism, Pontormo and Veronese, and I mispronounced everything from impasto to chiaroscuro. And my mom would pick me up and say, "Brian, where's your grammar?" And I would say, "She's on the back porch with Grandpa," like that. So that experience sort of catapulted me into making things, and I still consider myself someone who makes things rather than paints. I didn't know you could be a painter. The first artist I ever met was me in Myrtle Beach, and I developed an early fascination with carnival banners because I grew up in a resort town with state fairs and the amusement parks. So I noticed these beautiful handmade banners which used very clear, concise, intense color to make compositions that would represent a pie eating contest or a human cannonball or whatever it was. And that helped me learn how to compose visual imagery, larger elements at the periphery, gradually getting smaller and smaller as you work toward the climax of the image or the detonation point of the image. Still the way I compose now. And I remember my ever supportive parents got me the name and number of a gentleman in Conway who painted the carnival banners, and I wrote him a fan letter, which I like to do, and I asked for his autograph. And then a couple of weeks later, I got a letter that said, "Dear Brian, unfortunately, I don't give out my autograph. Sincerely," and it was, it was, yeah. I think it's the greatest thing ever. So So I was set. I turned 17. There was no other choice for me but to go to Charleston, to the College of Charleston, a city which I was very familiar with since I was a little kid. And there I went. And my first art class ever was William Halsey's last.
That's amazing. Can you talk a little bit about working with Halsey and knowing Corey McCallum as well?
Yes, so Halsey and McCallum were very early supporters of mine. They were friends, and in Bill's case, he was my first teacher. So it was 1984. I had always felt in Myrtle Beach that I had a family, my brothers and my parents, but there was another family that I was missing. And when I got to Charleston, off the elevator comes Bill Halsey and Jay Bardin, a very well-known South Carolina painter, talking about a Picasso painting called Bust of a Man, 1971, I think. And they talked for about 15 minutes arguing about it, and I was like, oh my God, this is my family. And from that point on, I remember he told me that a painting is like a circus tent. It's wooden sticks with some cloth draped over it. So there's always the feeling of its inevitable dismantling. And I liked that because I like the notion that a painting is here and then you almost feel like it could disappear. And there's something about that transference of energy between the spectator and the picture and the notion that it might just disappear. So you're always trying to keep it from disappearing. And I learned that from Halsey. And I also liked the fact that in Charleston, a lot of painters were focused on Tony King Street and the pastel-hued, facades and the wrought iron gates. Beautiful. But Halsey was interested in the backdoor approach, the dilapidated alleys, the crumbling stucco, the mossy, slimy cemeteries. And he taught me that sometimes just the manipulation of material, mixing marble dust with paint, using cardboard and metal to scrape the surface, all of those attentions to material were in themselves a form of content. And that's still something that remains with me today, that the process itself is the delivery system for its own content. A painting doesn't necessarily have to be about anything, but it can create an experience that is complex, enduring, just simply because of the artist's attention to the nuances of surface. So I learned that from him. And then years later, after I had already moved to New York, I became friends with Corey. And the differences between them was fascinating to me in their work. Whereas everybody knows his is more of a full frontal, sort of rigorous, planar approach to color. And Corey's was more musical, more personal, more travel journal, more Paul Klee, if you will. Not head on, but kind of on the side. And I loved that about her work and still do. And she was a huge supporter of mine up until she passed. And we shared a love of grilled cheese and Bartok string quartets.
Awesome. This gallery really focuses almost exclusively on post-war South Carolinian art. So that's really our mission here. And Halsey's one of our artists, Barden's another one of our artists. And I think one of the things I really enjoy about working with this select group of work is a lot of times you have a teacher and a student. And I'm always amazed at how different a student will be from a good teacher. Because a good teacher doesn't create copies of himself or herself.
Right.
They create a unique artist. And I don't think many people understand the unique history that South Carolina's had in modern art and how South Carolinian teachers have taught other South Carolinian artists. We have several art teachers here as well that are teaching the next generation of artists. So do you have anything that you want to say about like a South Carolina vision towards art and how that's affected your career?
It's at one both an attention and a love of place, of this beautiful state that we call our home, and also an eye forward to what's possible with that clear anchor to the land, to the landscape that we live in. And a good case in point is Michael Tyzak, who was born in Sheffield, part of there's a group of 70s painters in England, studied at the Slade School, but then basically founded, along with Diane Johnson, the art department at College of Charleston. And he became my mentor after Halsey retired in 1984 and became a father figure to me. And there's not a day, I promise you, that goes by that I don't think about Michael Tyzak. And he did, sort of hard edge, very rigorous geometric abstraction, very non-objective. And I did these sort of mucky, muddy, humid landscapes, and he was the greatest thing in the world to me because it went beyond just subject matter and went to content, or it went from less about describing into something more of impression. And if we look at the words description versus impression, a description refers to an impulse or an experience that you took in and turned into knowledge. It takes empirical evidence and turns it into knowledge, and then you can then record or replicate that knowledge. Whereas an impression is something that hits you but already passed, and you have to sort of recreate or possess that experience. So it's much more about the impression part, I think, than the descriptive part. And that gives you a lot of leeway and freedom. So even though I paint abstractly, I use the process of abstraction. They're not really abstract paintings. I don't believe there's any such thing as an abstract painting. Every painting represents something, even if it's hard-edged geometric abstraction. You're still trying to represent something. And Tyzak always talked about that. So there is the problem that we face as painters. What am I representing? And I think the answer, as with a lot of things, was with Walt Disney. In 1938, he had a problem. How do you give hands to a mouse? And he tried a bunch of different things, and then he came up with a white glove with 4 sausage fingers and 3 black lines, and he solved the problem because he had clear intention and he had purposeful execution, and he put those 2 things together. When the intent and the execution are the same thing, you've got molten lava. So I always think of that when I think about my teachers, especially Tyzak.
One last South Carolina question. One thing that I like about Southern painters is they paint humidity. They really paint that space between spaces that the humidity will create. Mm-hmm. Talk about how you try to achieve that a little bit, because it's really hard.
Yeah, it is very hard. So the thickness of the air, the water droplets in the air, as we all know, it suspends light and heat, and it's like this hot steaming towel over your face. So there's a feeling of falling to your knees and completely resigning to something that is just so friggin' hot, you know? And that's a good starting point for me, the notion of capitulation, of dropping to your knees and you give up. And I always say a painter is born the moment he or she gives up. Steve Martin said, it's easy to be great, it's hard to be good. What you want to do is be consistently good. Forget about great. Anybody can be great once in a while. So that notion of giving up trying to be great, very important. But technically, to talk about how I get those sort of sheaths or vapors of humidity, it's employing very large, soft brushes and mixtures of a combination of terpenoid and what's called a cold wax medium, which is kind of a peanut butter consistency. And we talked about it a second ago. And very easy to dilute with the paint thinner, and you can apply it in sort of vaporous veils, and you let it dry, and you can buff it. And it sort of creates a little bit of a barrier or membrane between the viewer and some of the imagery that's happening in the distance. So I compose, as I said, with those carnival banners, big information around the sides, large dynamic shapes, gradually sort of moving into a deeper space toward the center. So there's that notion of almost a stage or a proscenium, this artificial window, which is very highly composed, even though it's a landscape, pushing you or pulling you deeper and deeper into space. And that humidity is what does that.
Last night when we had the opening, I got so many questions about your mediums and how you get the different levels of gloss and the different passages of the painting. How many different mediums do you use, and how do you approach the painting? Is it in stages, or when you're applying the different layers of texture and gloss?
That is a lot of trial and error. I've been painting since I was 10, so 47 years, and a lot of trial and error. It's kind of like you judge a pilot not by how many exotic destinations he or she has flown to, you judge them by how many flight hours they've logged. So it's about flight hours. How many days do I show up at the studio and work and fail? And it's so much failure. If you saw my studio, it's this deep in scraped off paint on the floor. So mediums, I've tried a lot of things over the years. I'm a personal friend of Robert Gamblin, who makes a beautiful line of artist pigments and mediums. And he has a product called Galkyd, which is an alkyd resin. And it dries rather quickly, and it dries fairly shiny. and it's a little bit sticky. And what it does is it mixes with the oil paint and sort of dissolves the brush marks and creates almost like a jewel. Like it just becomes like a hard enamel-like surface. That I'll do a few drops of walnut oil into it. And I've used linseed and all sorts of sunflower and lavender oil and all those things. But walnut's my favorite. It smells good. It yellows less than linseed. Sometimes requires refrigeration, so make sure you have a little fridge. And I find that it just slows the drying time, and it's a nice medium for me. So I've kind of narrowed it down to that. And in terms of the process of how I create shows, I generally do 2 solo shows a year in galleries around the country. I know the schedule 4 or 5 years in advance, and what I do is work on one show at a time. Each show's approximately 10 to 12 paintings, and it takes about 8 months to make a show. So in my studio, I have about the size of this room, and I rotate all day long. I mainly work on one painting for 10 minutes and then not see it again for a week. Just depends on the drying time. It gets humid on 27th Street as well in New York. And that slows the drying time, so I can sort of gauge where I need to be based on my schedule, based on the drying time. So at the end of 8 months, hopefully I have a chromatically related series of work. And I title them all from usually poetry and things derived from here, from South Carolina. So there's usually that element. Titles, rivers, things like that. Real kind of homegrown things that feel good to me.
Awesome. Last question, because we're going to open it up to the audience. Talk about how New York has influenced your work, living and working in New York.
Yeah. So when I was just finishing in college at Charleston, I had entered, I'd been in little group shows around, and I was starting to, enter my slides into, curated shows and things like that. And it was really hard. I would get rejected and stuff. And I remember sitting with Tyzak at a restaurant on George Street. And I asked him, before I go to New York, how do you do this? How do you get longevity? What's the secret to this? And he put down his coffee cup and his piece of toast, and he looked at me just for a second, this little twinkle in his eye, and he said, "This is really good toast." Yeah. And it took me a while to figure out what that meant, and it essentially taught me that life is not about having more but wanting less, that everything is enough, that this is okay right here. That's so beautiful, and it's right in front of me. And a lot of times the answer is right there. All the subject matter you need is right there. So that sent me off packing to New York City. And I arrived at LaGuardia Airport with 2 black Samsonite suitcases, one with my clothes, one with my brushes. And in the lining of one of my jackets in the clothing bag, my mom sewed $500 cash and a one-way ticket back on Piedmont Airlines, which is, I don't think, even extant anymore. And the money and the ticket are still there. So it worked out. And Tyzak told me, if you're hungry, you have 2 choices. You can either start a garden or move to where the food is. And I wanted to be near the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and that's essentially the reason I moved there, and it's still the reason I love living there. In terms of the visual imagery that I make, you'll notice that the horizon lines are always very high, and there's an enormous feeling of light issued from the top, sort of plunging down. There's a lot of emphasis on vertical and horizontal, which relates to trees, but also to that Gothic, landscape of being in Manhattan, where there's such a premium on light that you're surrounded and sort of closed in. And that sort of gives me a sort of a template to work with on my landscape paintings. And we've raised 2 kids there, and my wife, my gynecologist, my wife is an OBGYN, and we have a good life.
So it's almost a northern view on a southern landscape.
Yes, or it's
or a city view.
Yeah, or it's southern spirit with a New York vernacular.
Any questions?
Hudson. Yeah, because our apartment's on 85th between Broadway and West End, and we're 2 blocks from the Hudson River. I've always loved that. It's always about the shape and the word, not about the content. It's just a beautiful word. Hudson, yeah. How do I determine painting versus canvas? The size, yes. Sometimes it'll be the gallery where I'm going to show, maybe the size of the gallery. The works on paper are sometimes, they're they're lower in price point, so sometimes it's a good entry point for a younger or newer collector to maybe acquire or work. And they're also give me a chance to sort of work through ideas a little quicker than a big, much more sort of committed canvas, because these things are pretty intense, the linen and the stretchers and all that. So the paper I can rip up and destroy. I tear up a lot of work, and it lets me work through ideas quicker. Yeah, for the paper, I use regular latex like Sherwin-Williams, just white sort of eggshell, and then I sand it down a couple of times. So there's a few coats of the latex, and then I sand it. Yeah. Yes. Do I ever use Archer's paper for oil? I like their watercolor block or their printmaking block, the hot pressed. It's 300-pound weight, so it almost stands up by itself. And once I get a hold of it, it could walk by itself like that. Yeah. And I do use a lot of sandpaper and tools, pieces of wood or glass or things that Halsey would do to sort of trowel down and get back to that deckled, that tooth of the paper. The oil penetrates in, yeah, so you get, especially transparent colors will seep in there and stain the ground. And then when you scrape, you take away the texture, but you get the beautiful luminosity of the light bouncing from the room onto the white and through the lens of the color, like a gel on a theatrical light. So it's a nice kind of stained glass effect. Yeah, all the way through. The sanding, I do it intermittently over the course of several months. Got to let it dry completely, and definitely wear a mask when you do that. My contact with Alicia Rhett, the very well-known Charleston portraitist, born and bred in Charleston, perhaps better known for playing India Wilkes, Ashley Wilkes' sister in Gone with the Wind. And she had a fairly sizable screen time there, and she lived in a beautiful carriage house on the peninsula, which I can't remember where it was. And my parents, with their love affair with Charleston, we'd drive down probably twice a month, and they hired her to do a pastel portrait of myself and my three brothers on our 10th birthday. So I was first. They took me to the carriage house on a sequence of Saturdays. I think it was in the autumn. And I went into this big dark house, and it smelled like furniture polish and soup. And this little old lady with a easel and her cream paper and this beautiful battalion of colors lined up like the markings of a diamondback snake, all organized. And then a little chair, a black chair, I remember that, and I would sit for her. And she, over the course of a few weeks, did a beautiful portrait of this 10-year-old blue-eyed, kid with a bowl cut. And what I think interested her was that I had a lot of questions. I constantly asked questions, and she would bring me around behind the easel to look at what she was doing. I was asking how you get the rose of the cheek to turn and get cooler in temperature as it goes back toward my ear. How do you get the shine in my little haircut, my shampooed hair? How do you get the glint in my eye? And she would tell me. And then it was finished. And she said, Brian, come around here and take a look. And my instinct, before I even thought, was to take my finger and smudge this blue eye like that. Yeah. So it was all like smeared. And I thought, she's going to hit me with a polo mallet like that. And she said, I think you're an artist. So, yeah. Yeah. And the picture's in the book, which we have here, the paperback book. And so I was 10 years old, and I've never forgotten that. She was very kind, and I think spent the remainder of her days in Charleston. Had no interest in the limelight and all the publicity that came with that. But I do know that she became friends with Clark Gable, and he, playing Rhett Butler, who had dalliances in Charleston, asked her a lot about what it was like, and tried to get a real feel for the city itself. My favorite blue, that's a good question. I would say cobalt blue, pure, not hue. It's a good middle blue. It's neither warm, which is essentially what ultramarine is, being closer to red, nor cool, which is cerulean blue, which is closer to green. Cobalt is in the middle. It's the one Cezanne would go to when he needed air. And that's how he got atmosphere and air in his paintings, was a little bit of cobalt blue mixed with probably lead white then. So cobalt blue is my favorite. That's a good question. In terms of when I prepare for a show, how do I determine what the nature or I won't say theme because it's all the same theme, will be for that show. Yes. If I do show in New Mexico, sometimes I will think about more desert colors, and I'll look at the Transcendental painting group from the 50s, and I'll think about colors like cobalt green and pale periwinkle and deep sort of apricot orange, things that you might see out there. Also, if I do a commission in a particular geographical location, I will think about that locale. Otherwise, it sort of pretty much stays the same. I sort of, I always say it's important to have a limited perspective and to do one thing over and over and over again to try to get good at it. So it pretty much stays the same in terms of how I proceed with that. I just thought of when I was a kid, we used to do carpool to go to class. And there was a mom named Miss Williams who would pick us up, and she would bark at me to roll up the window because you're letting the smoke out after she lit a cigarette, like that. And I remember her son saying, "Mom, was I adopted?" And he said, "Not yet." She said, "Not yet? I haven't signed the papers," like that. And we had been studying To Kill a Mockingbird, and we were talking about fate, the role of fate. And I remember we asked her, "Do you believe in free will?" And she said, "I don't have a choice." Yeah, which I thought it took me a long time to realize how brilliant that was. So in magic, which I'm interested in, stage magic, the magician Penn Jillette said, the secret to magic is making what you have to do look like it's what you wanted to do. So in other words, if I pass the magic wand from my right hand to my left to pick up this coffee cup, that wasn't random, that was planned. The idea is to get you to look over here while I make a move over here. So that's very much part of what painting is too, making it look effortless, making what's highly labored and planned out look extemporaneous, and making what you have to do appear like what you want to do. And that, I think, maybe circles back to the how I prepare for those shows. Yes, in terms of how many paintings I work on at the same time, and yeah. So sometimes only 10 or 20 minutes on one painting, and I'll move it aside and rotate. And it's an interesting question because I don't really notice. I don't pay attention. They sort of tell me what they need, and I have them all lined up around. And if I have a problem with the purple in this painting, I know I can solve it by going to the next one. Phyllis Diller, the comedian who my mom loved, said, if you find the audience doesn't think you're funny, quit. So I always quit really quickly. If it's not working and if there's not that transfer of energy, I quit. I put it down, I go to a different one. And that sort of keeps me going through that sequence. And what was the second? Yes. Yes, about any points in my career thus far where I felt like I needed to break out or move into something different. Not really, because I try to stand on the narrowest piece of real estate possible, the postage stamp size piece of geography, which is here where I grew up in South Carolina. And I use it, by limiting it, I don't feel like I ever need to move beyond the perimeters of that postage stamp. Everything is right in there. What I want to do is magnify that postage stamp to the size of a movie screen. So I don't necessarily plan or feel like I need to branch out or move in or evolve into anything. That's a big word. I feel like I need to stay the course and keep plugging away, sometimes in vain, at this same thing over and over. I think it was Duke Ellington said, the wise musicians play what they can master. So I try to feel like if I can just try to get good at one thing, I think that'll be enough for me. How did I choose my studio? I've been in Manhattan for 36 years. And because it's so prohibitively expensive, what we did after grad school, I went to the School of Visual Arts, was I teamed up with 3 other artists and we rented a space together. First in Tribeca for about 15 years, and then, condos and everything, they pushed us out. And then we went to 27th Street and we took a whole floor and we subdivided it into individual spaces. And then we sublet 2 of the spaces out to an architect and a professional designer. And it's the only way to do it, so that we can share those expenses. And in terms of the lighting in the studio, it's got 12-foot ceilings and huge north-facing windows, which face kind of where the Empire State Building is, even though a new building went up and you can't see it. But I've never been one to respond to natural light as much. I like this kind of light. and I like to make the paintings under the same light that they'll be exhibited in. So kind of a warm incandescent light is my favorite to work in. I don't paint outdoors in plein air. I have before, but all of the work that y'all see here and that I do is all studio work. They say that all painting is studio painting when contemplated. Even landscape, it's all studio painting because the work is really done. You lay an entire landscape out on your table, and that becomes the world to you, that rectangle table. So I like the artificial light. How do I keep my paints from day to day, from drying? I don't really. I work every day, and because I'm squeezing all those tubes, I use the big 150 milliliter tubes. I don't really do any of the, no caps. I use it all up, yeah. I'm the size of Country Bear Jamboree, so I have really strong hands. So I can squeeze out every last drop of the paint. And I know where everything is, even though the tubes are completely gray from all the mixing of colors. But I know by the shape and by where I was the night before what it is. And you remember where you put it, yeah. Yeah, kind of in a temperature range, cool colors, warm colors. It's where you put things. And, yeah, yeah. And sometimes, you know, I always advise painters to keep a messy studio. Painting, in fact, all art is about the cross-pollination of things that don't go together. And the best ideas don't often come at you from the front, they come from the side. So you have to pay attention and you have to be always working because lightning strikes so rarely you're there and you're working. So it's important to keep a messy studio. There's stuff all over the floor. You know, when a studio looks like a sushi bar, I think it's hard to make mistakes happen. And very often things, when you pick up the wrong color, manganese blue instead of cobalt blue, maybe something will happen that I didn't expect. And yeah, yeah. And it's also so much more fun. Like, you know, if you're a pilot, you want to know where the buttons are and stuff. But for us, you know, we can noodle around a little bit. Yes, about layering color and underpainting starting out. Often if I have a general idea that I might want a warmer painting in the end, like for instance, the two behind us there, a little bit warmer in temp, I'll start with an underpainting of a cooler color. So maybe a pale magenta, a pale pink, or a lavender or something, or even pale cool green. And I'll thin that down with only thinner terpenoid, no medium at all. It's fat over lean, so you want to go lean. And I'll gradually build up on top of that. The first things I'll do after the underpainting is dry is I'll come in with verticals and horizontals. Vertical always referring to a tree or to a human being, and a horizontal always to the landscape. And the idea of being awake and asleep, and then the diagonal, which you introduce also, is everything in between. So life, death, and in between. Those three orientations are in almost any painting you see, and it's sometimes fun to think about that when you look at Vermeer, for instance. Those three orientations do very dynamic things in a composition. And then I just build up over time, layer by layer, some translucent, some opaque, and some completely transparent. If a cool painting, I'll start out with warmer colors. Burnt sienna, for instance, red ochre, things like that. And by allowing little glints of the original underpainting to peek through, which Van Gogh did often, you see the raw canvas sort of peeking through. And what it does is it allows the painting to almost breathe in and out. You're seeing the history of the picture. You're looking back in time to those initial moments when the canvas was primed and he was in the field or whatever. And I can picture pollen dust blowing and all that. And you see little bits of that. So I try to leave little bits of the underpainting to show through. And that warm, cool combination is a good way to do that. Thank you. Yes. Yep. There's, have I ever done a painting that I had to keep for myself? I try to keep one painting for each body of work. When Katie and I got married in 1999, there was one that I did for her. It's called A Gaze for Catherine. And that one is in our living room. And that's a very special one. When my two kids, Olivia and Christian, were born, there were paintings that I did then, sort of in response to all the, that sprouting of a new organ in one's chest that makes you love in ways you never thought you could. So there's a couple paintings that I have from that. Otherwise, I don't. I don't. I was talking to Sandy this morning. I don't remember making any of these, and they don't feel complete until they go to someone. So I love that part. I did. Yeah, with raising two kids, neither of whom have any interest in the visual arts, even though they love Daddy's work and what I do. But I always kept materials on the table. They were always free to draw and take things. And I would do magic tricks and art projects in their classes at elementary school. I still do that. And I go in and read to kids, and I'll do a little bit of magic, and it mortified them with embarrassment when I'd come in, with a wig on and a magic wand and stuff. But now they're in college in Charleston, and they relish those experiences. So neither of them are so inclined, but they have a deep appreciation for it, as does my wife, who was an art history major and a ballet dancer as well. So it's a nice little synchronicity that we have there. Yeah. Yes, is it clear when I'm finished? That goes back to the flight hours, the idea of how many flight hours one accrues, and the notion of experience. It's a difficult question, knowing when one is finished. Picasso would often say that he stops just before he's finished. You want to give just a little bit of unfinished quality and verve to the picture. You don't want it to be completely vacuum sealed and finished, at least in this kind of work. So I think just sheer experience of knowing when it's done, when all the colors seem to hum, which was a Halsey word, that music, the colors hum together. I don't know of any other way to describe it other than the hum. And Philip Guston said that when you start a painting, you have a room full of people from your past, all your teachers, all your friends, your family. And as you work over days and months and sometimes years, they start to leave the room. And then when you're finished, you leave the room and you close the door. That's interesting. The idea of cross-pollination with a figure from the past that one might admire or learn from, and what might that look like? That's fodder for a little essay or something, I think, for me. What I love about painting, and no other art form that I'm aware of does this, is that when you stand in front of a painting, you are standing in the exact same spot that the painter did, that Rembrandt did in 1666. You're standing in the same spot a few feet away from the surface. So there's a joining of consciousness that transcends all the hundreds of years in between when he worked and when I work. And you're seeing through his eyes, and you're experiencing through his brain, which is what a work of art should do. It should bring you into the mind of the artist and let you see the world for a moment differently than the way that you've previously seen it. So I think if Remy worked across the hall from me, I think I would ask him about drawing, about how to draw, how to render the three-dimensional world on the two-dimensional surface, of which they are exquisite. I would ask him about thick and thin paint, because if you look at a Rembrandt from the side, you'll notice the lights, the nose, the cheek, are so clunky you could pick up the painting by them. And then the darks are thin, they're vaporous. So there's that notion of build-up to get almost a three-dimensional tactility and sculpted quality to a face. And I would also ask him about getting old. How does one get old? Because we see him age from this idyllic, sparkly-eyed young man into this sort of teary-eyed, rosy-cheeked, almost beaten-down carcass of a person in the end. I'm thinking of the famous one in the Metropolitan Museum. And it something dawned on me very recently. I realized that in my 20s and 30s, I cared all the time about what people thought of me. And then in my 40s, I decided I don't care what people think about me. And now I'm in my 50s, and I realize that nobody ever thought about me like that. And I think that's maybe what we would talk about, how to not take oneself so seriously. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes, about the past and maybe any familial interest or contact with the arts. My father was a very sensitive man and a poet. He was an attorney by trade, but he was a loner, and he wrote poetry and did little sketches, as far back as, childhood. And he actually self-published a book of his poetry. He's no longer with us. So he had an innate and very deep interest in self-expression and solitude, and he sort of ran interference for me. My mother was raised by an Albanian family in Myrtle Beach. They had a mom-and-pop restaurant, steaks, chops, seafood, and very practical-minded. And she would encourage me. She saw that I could draw, and that's basically all I wanted to do, to be an architect or a radiologist or things like that, which would use those skills. But, for an income, Oscar Wilde said it's better to have a steady income than be fascinating. Best to do both. And my dad would run interference. He would like on the side give me more watercolors and more. So in a sense, I lived all of his dreams. So he was the one, I think, that was the sensitive one, and I definitely channel a lot of that. Beyond that, not really. They were very practical, very hardworking, very family-oriented people, and very humble. And I think I had really good teachers to express gratitude and be well grounded. So I was lucky. I was taught well, and they gave me the freedom to move to New York when I did, and they helped me out in school. But then once school ended, I got multiple jobs and struggled. But it wasn't a struggle because I was doing what I wanted to do, and I kept my expenses low and my time as free as possible. So I did night jobs. I waited tables. I was an art assistant for a couple of painters. I worked in a storeroom of a shoe store on Fifth Avenue. Whatever it took, to sort of earn the $375 a month to live in a 15 by 15 room. And I wouldn't do anything different. Oh, I like these. Yes. The music, and do I listen to music when I work? I always listen to something, whether it be a podcast or NPR or music, mostly chamber music, mostly Baroque music. And my role model to this day is the Canadian pianist Glenn Gould, who lived from 1932 to 1982. And I often say the greatest painter to me who ever lived wasn't a painter. It was he. And I spent many years in my 20s and 30s and 40s taking the train from Penn Station, the Maple Leaf Express, up to Toronto, where I would pour through his entire cataloged output of notes and all the outtakes from his recordings. And he had long since died, so I was stalking a dead guy. And I would hold his shoes and look at his prescriptions. And I don't know what I was looking for, Tom, but I would know it when I found it. So that idea of having a musical figure is really important. And I do like the meter of music, the dynamics of loud to soft. And so I always have to have something on. Electronic wallpaper, it becomes. No visualization of words in the work. I like, Halsey told me if you want to paint shapes and colors, you have to see the world as shapes and colors. So if you learn how to see everything as just forms and varying degrees of chroma, then it's easier to paint it. So a tree becomes just a series of planks of color of varying degrees of intensity, and the sky might become various temperatures of blue or pink. So no words. It sort of is meant to sort of communicate something, but non-verbally.
And you have one?
Yes, literature. I mostly read nonfiction and poetry. Rita Dove, Derek Mann. I'm thinking of some poets recently. Edward Harkness that I like. Wallace Stevens. Even someone like Archibald Rutledge, the poet laureate of South Carolina in 1971, I believe. I collect his poetry. In terms of not much fiction, actually. I mentioned Harper Lee, of course. Moby Dick I read recently. I try to read certain books every few years, and To Kill a Mockingbird is one of them. But mostly poetry and nonfiction. So a lot of art history, a lot of William V. Dunning is a favorite of mine. Fritz Novotny wrote a book about 19th century European painting. Slatkin, there's a critic that I was recently reading. Yeah, mostly nonfiction. Yeah. What's that? Oh, Eighth Street Women. Of course. Yeah, I did read that. Yes, a beautiful book, which is going to be a film, I understand. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Extraordinary painters. Yeah. And as good or better than their counterparts. Yeah. In terms of COVID and how that affected color and the overall landscape of the work. So my wife is a physician, and back in March of 20, we have a lot of doctor friends, and they knew that this was going to be serious. So Katie was taking care of COVID patients in Lenox Hill Hospital, and she was very fearful for herself, but also for myself and our two kids. So we have a little house in Long Island in Southampton, and she basically sent myself, my two kids, and my son's best friend out there indefinitely to keep us away, to protect both her and her patients and also us. So I don't have a studio there. I might in the future. I drew, but I felt like my job was really to keep the food hot and the towels clean for these kids because they were in online school. That was so stressful for them. So I pretty much stayed busy and just would collapse at night of exhaustion of taking care of them. And it was interesting because in a way, the whole world got to live like we artists always have. Forced isolation. You're cut off from the world, sometimes by choice, and you're forced into looking inward and to trying to reconnect or retether yourself to things that were maybe more important, things that we lost sight of, family, of love, of travel, and things that we took for granted. So it was a good sort of re-nourishing period for me. And then after 4 months of not seeing Katie, she drove out with a friend of ours, and we had to hug through a shower curtain because she's still, we didn't know how this thing was transmitted. So that was, it was really scary. And I ended up getting it the November of 2020, as my whole family did. So. That was interesting. When I went back, I walked in the room and I swept, cleaned up like is my habit, a little menial labor first. And I picked up brushes, and it was like nothing ever happened. Nothing ever changed. Yeah, you just connect to that stream immediately. How many in my lifetime? That would be hard. I would have to really think about that. I'm definitely less productive than I used to be. I do 2 solo shows a year, so that's probably about 20 paintings of different sizes, not all that big, mostly these sizes, kind of middle sizes. So definitely less. I spend longer on the paintings, and so definitely less production as I get older. Oh, a short week course? Probably, I would say Art Students League. Yeah, it's visible. It's on 57th Street near Carnegie Hall. It's got a storied tradition of painters from the 1800s. Anna Hyatt Huntington, I think, studied there, as many painters did. I've lectured there. I've never taught there. The New York Studio School on 8th Street, although I don't know if they do short things like that. So I would say Art Students League. My pleasure. Thank you, Sandy.